And also, if you can let me know when it's time to close, that would be great. Maybe a few minutes before. Thank you. So first of all, thank you both. I would say really two legends here today, especially for me. I cannot really overstate how much I've been learning from both of you and how much your work has been inspiring boundaryless work and myself. So first of all, let me introduce you. Indy is the founding director of 00 and Dark Matter Labs, among many other things that I don't want to say, just because it would take too much time to go through all. And John is formerly director of Deloitte Center for the Edge, author of probably one of the most significant books in I don't know, in history of organizational development. That was The Power of Pull, that goes even beyond that. And now coming up with a new book called Journey Beyond Fear. I must say, I'm introducing this conversation based on the fact that I really want to favor a conversation among yourself, between you two. So I would try to step in as less as possible. But essentially, this is the problem, that the question that we have on the table. So we foresee the challenges now go much beyond the boundaries of our existing institutions. So the question is really, how do we face these challenges? How do we create a new growth thesis that can really play out in between organizations and in between us, beyond the borders that the frames, let's say, that we used to have, and we seem to be failing to transcend. And maybe Indy, maybe I would like to ask you to start, because Indy, you were prompting me to have this conversation with John a few months ago, and I'm so happy that finally we made it happen.
I have to say, I'm really honored to be here in the same space with John. I've been really loving your work at the Edge and every report that you've done. And Simone, I just love the journey that you're on. So start by sitting there. I think this is a really important conversation. It's very clear that the climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of the problem. And if you accept the thesis that climate change is a symptom of the problem, then you very quickly, I think, come to the conclusion that it is a foundational failure in how we structure and code corporations. That is one of the key problems. The key problem is that we live in a world where externalities that are unvalued and unpriced in the system and are being spilled over to the point that it's becoming self-terminating for us as a civilization. And the externalities are literally self-terminating us. So we have moved from operating in a world where externalities could be largely ignored, and we could imagine the corporate as a siloed system based on single point transactions. Could move to a world where you could operate in, I don't know why this sounds, because I'm going to take my headphones to see if that's any better. Sorry about this. So I was just saying that I wonder, so if we work with the assumption that climate change is a symptom, I think one of the big problems is, and we're operating in a world of interconnection, and we're operating in a world of radical interconnection between the externalities, and they're feedbacking into us. So we've gone from an infinite world to a small world scenario. In that small world scenario, it's very clear those interactions are now visible and effective and are self-terminating. Our theory of corporation was built in an idea of silos and the ability to create, in a way, I would say, silo points of value, discrete points of value. In an entangled world, how do we deal with that? I think is a really fundamental problem. And the entanglement operates in multiple types of layers. It's very clear we have to talk about what is the human layer, what is the machine layer, what is the kind of material layer, what is perhaps even the kind of what I'd call the bi-integral layer. And how these things come back, interact with each other is going to be really critical. So for me, there's a fundamental question about the idea of a corporation in the 21st century. What does it really need to operate like? Is it actually an individual? Is it actually an object? Or is it part of an entanglement? And how do you operate in that entanglement is a really critical issue. And this opens up two big theses, and I'll stop there. One, our current model of organizing is entirely focused on command and control as a thesis. Command and control in a complex emergent world is virtually impossible for any meaningful interaction. So how do we move from a command and control world to a craft and distributed engagement world, which isn't based on command and control? Because we cannot predict at any center point what those externalities will be. It's not possible for government to predict them. It's not possible for leaders to predict them. The information asymmetry between a CEO and somebody on the front line is something like 80% or certainly 70%. I can't remember the numbers. In that world, we need a fundamental pivot of the organization where the CEO as leadership team has to become much more about learning orientated as opposed to command and control orientated. And these are structural shifts for me that require us to operate differently. And innovation has to be on the front line in relationship to all those other worlds. And that, I think, is a really, really important part of the conversation. So, and that requires structural transformation of how we perceive risk, how we understand risk, how we manage risk, all the way to what leadership really looks like in those formats. So I open up into that frame. I'm sorry about the sound earlier.
John, if you feel like jumping in.
Sure. No, I am very excited about the broad theme of the gathering. I think one of the key themes in my new book is this notion of the increasing importance of learning platforms, which I think are quite different from the platforms we have today. And in that context, I will say that when I talk about learning, I'm not talking about sharing existing knowledge, listening to lectures or workshops, videos. No, it's coming together and acting together to create new knowledge by confronting situations that haven't been confronted before. And in a rapidly changing world, that's the most powerful form of learning, is creating new knowledge versus just sharing existing knowledge. But I will say that I think one of the big barriers or obstacles to creating these kinds of learning platforms is the emotion of fear. I believe, and it was the catalyst for me to write this new book, that the dominant emotion that we're encountering around the world is fear. And if we don't focus on the emotions that are shaping our choices and actions, we can talk about platforms all day long and nothing will happen. If it's driven by fear, the key in fear is you shorten your time horizons, you lose trust in others, you don't want to collaborate, you want to just hold on to what you have. And I think that's a really significant barrier or obstacle to creating these kinds of platforms. And in that context, I'll just say, again, my book is about the journey beyond fear. How do we overcome the fear? But I think one key element here is the notion of framing what I call opportunity-based narratives. And here I will say that I make a strong distinction between stories and narratives. Stories, most people view them as the same thing, but for me, stories are self-contained. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end to them. And the story is about the storyteller, or it's about some other people, real or imagined. It's not about you. For me, a narrative is very different. It's open-ended. There is no resolution yet. There's some kind of big threat or opportunity out in the future. Not clear whether it's going to be achieved or not. And the resolution of the narrative hinges on you. It's a call to action, to say your choices, your actions are going to help resolve this narrative. What's it going to be? And in that context, I would say that one of the challenges I see is that we are increasingly being driven by threat-based narratives. The world is falling apart. We're all going to die. We need to mobilize now and resist. And by the way, that just feeds the fear. That intensifies that we're going to die. Oh my God. I got to hold on to what I have. I can't trust anybody. I can't do anything. Sorry. Versus if you can frame a really inspiring opportunity that excites people, and where the call to action is to achieve this, we need to come together to achieve this opportunity. And by the way, this opportunity is huge and very different from anything we've ever seen before. So we're going to have to learn a lot as we go. And then I'll just say as a final note, one of the key themes in learning for me, and this is based on a lot of the research I've done, is no matter how smart or talented we are as individuals, we're going to learn a lot faster as part of a small group. I've become a strong proponent of something that I call impact groups, but they are typically between 3 to 15 participants. They're small groups because the goal is to develop deep trust-based relationships with each other and then to support and challenge each other as you learn. And you learn a lot faster as part of these small groups. And then if you can connect them into broader networks, learning platforms become critical to scaling that learning. But start with the small groups. What's the small group you're going to join and act with so that you can learn faster? Let me stop there.
I mean, John, it's great that you landed there, because you have been always a big proponent of this idea of the team, that the team as the unit of improvement and learning and so on. And the world seems to be now very radical in this direction. We are basically living an age of micro-entrepreneurship, as we see, that, for example, the creator economy on one hand is pushing forward this idea that as a creator, and it means as a team, essentially, I can, create great impact and, create these learning spaces, these communities. On the other hand, we see organizations evolving towards this idea of small teams, swarming small teams supported by shared platforms. And my impression is that we are already moving in the organizational space, preparing ourselves to collaborate much more cross-organizationally. But I want to stress one point as I throw the ball again, maybe to Indy, that it seems that, and this resonates a lot with your question, with your points on fear, John, that it seems like structural lock-ins that are much more related to our institutions, our government institutions, our policy making, kind of prevent us to really create these opportunity-based narratives. It's like, Indy, you always make this reference to precariousness being used as a way to, not really empower people, but push them to actually become actors of distraction. You make this example that I quoted in the blog of the farmer that it cannot really regenerate its field because it needs to kind of live inside this machine of production and essentially drain every bit of energy from the field and distract it. So how does it fit? Is it true that the private sphere, the organizational sphere, is moving forward while our policies, our institutions seem to be lagging behind?
I mean, I would say yes, and I think precarity has been part of the macroeconomic model. I would argue precarity allows for the instrumentalization of labor, right? This is why politicians say, "Oh, we can't," we need to stop people getting lazy and sit at home and all that sort of stuff, because that's all about actually inducing people, forcing people, creating the conditions of precarity as a mechanism for them to find work. And in a way, I think the challenge that we face is that the thesis of precarity has almost become a baseline thesis now of institutions, where what we're creating is vulnerability, systemic vulnerability, which makes them more vulnerable to fear. So we're creating the conditions for fear to be the activating device as a mechanism. And I think there is a symbiotic relationship between, I think, John, what you're saying, which is why is fear being used. I think it's because we've created the conditions where fear is the fertile context. We've created the fertile context for fear. And I think these things then allow for a very poor form of organizing for value or destruction. So if you make people precarious, their decision-making structures become short-term. They become focused on sort of short-term psychological fixes, as opposed to they're not able to think long term. We know this happens. Any economic recession, you get these behaviors. Now, if you induce that same situation at the corporate level, where we've then induced the fear economy at the corporate level and the precarity in wages and the insecurity, which has been traditionally called labor market flexibility, actually it's destroyed the capacity for the discovery work that I think, John, that you're talking about, because it undermines the psychological conditions for that deep discovery. And I think this is a really critical issue. And I think this has been a false narrative that's been engineered for what I would call very thin models of efficiency, which has left most of our value formation engine really weak, unable to innovate, and unable to actually structurally move far. So I would totally agree with this. And I think this is part of the kind of symbiosis of bad corporate and sort of institutional lock-ins. And it manifests in simple things like our employment contracts. Our employment contracts are designed for failure. They're not designed for success. They're not inductions of trust. They're inductions of what is my risk that you are going to behave badly. In dark matter, we turned around and said, right, you take a minimum of 4 weeks holiday, not a maximum. So we're not designing maximum thresholds. We're actually turning it around in different formats. And I think that becomes really important. But with that, I hand over.
John, what's your idea, John, on this, the role of the collective institutions? Because your narrative, your ideas are very strong and seem to point a lot towards the person's responsibility, which is, I think, a fundamental point here that we want to address and push forward. But what is your idea in terms of how really our institutional agreements, our collective institutions can evolve to facilitate this journey beyond fear and beyond the structural lock-ins of the industrial economy? You're on mute. Sorry.
There we go. No, I think it's a significant need is to rethink and redefine our broader institutional environments. I would say it's our corporations are driven by fear. The leadership drives the people through fear. Our political environment, I would say increasingly in the political environment, we are being driven by threat-based narratives. The enemy is coming to get us. We're all going to die. We need to mobilize. They're feeding the fear. They're driving us towards more and more fear. And I think, again, it starts with individuals. I think if we don't recognize the challenge, I mean, change occurs by individuals. It doesn't occur by God or, some mystical power. We have to take action, but we have to take action recognizing that part of that action is to change the environments that we're in. And I will say too, that one of the things that I think an important shift for leaders, the way I see leadership today is in a scalable efficiency world, the mark of a strong leader is the one who has an answer to all the questions. No matter what the question is, you can count on the leader to have an answer. And if he doesn't, get rid of the person and find somebody who does. The mark of a strong leader in this new environment that we're talking about here is the one who has the most powerful questions and who will freely acknowledge they don't have an answer and ask for help. It starts to express vulnerability and say, number one, questions are really important. They're really good. Ask more questions and ask for help. And I think that's part of what can help, because the questions can inspire people to say, oh my God, that's exciting. If we could come up with an answer to that, we could accomplish amazing things. So it helps to make that journey beyond fear by framing really inspiring questions.
Please go, Indy.
John, one thing I wanted to sort of pick up on this fear conversation, which I think one of the things that I worry about right now is the lack of truth telling. And sometimes that's disguised under we don't want to use fearful narratives, right? So I find myself in rooms where people say, well, we can't say we're really heading for 3.5 degrees temperature rise. We can't really say that will be 24% reduction in wheat production in the global south, which would be catastrophic. So how do we have truthful conversations, which I also find myself shackled into, where we can't end up having truthful conversations on the guise that through a marketing logic, fear doesn't work. But actually, unless we have the truthful conversations, I worry that we skirt around reality. And there's an interesting question about integrity, and maybe it's the way we talk about this. We talk about it through a fear lens. We talk about it through a kind of structured logic lens. But I think there's something about how we have truthful conversations, because I'm finding myself often in conversations which are not tethered to reality.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I think truthful conversations are critical as a foundation for where we're going. And I think, again, at the risk of overemphasizing, I keep coming back to fear, because if we're driven by fear, truth is irrelevant. It's all about what I need to do to hold on to what I have and protect what I have because I'm under attack. And so I think that it's helping people to first of all acknowledge fear. One of the things I'm told is, I haven't heard many people expressing fear. Well, I believe we all live in cultures where fear is a sign of weakness. And we're not even willing to acknowledge to ourselves, much less to anyone else, that we're afraid. My God. So we express it in other forms, like anger. Anger is okay. That's a strong emotion. But if you go underneath the anger of so many people around the world today, I believe it's being driven by fear. And so I believe that ultimately we're going to start this by coming together in small groups and building trust with each other, where we can express vulnerability and be open and challenge each other too. I mean, a key part of these small groups is challenging, but challenging with respect, because we're all trying to get to a better answer. And again, I keep coming back. I think this whole focus on threat, the world's going to collapse, we're all going to die. No, focus on what could we accomplish if we all came together? What amazing things could we accomplish? And yes, by the way, we'll address a lot of the challenges that we're facing today, but it's all about the opportunity. And that's missing in all the conversations I've been in.
I find it fascinating that we are getting into these questions around integrity, acceptance, and opportunity-based narratives. And essentially, I think if we acknowledge the existing lock-ins and we, to some extent, we face this institutional failure. To some extent, with integrity and truthfulness, and we keep our opportunity, we engage with opportunities to rebuild our institutions. I think this is a key point, because when John points towards, for example, small teams and interactions and rebuilding these learning platforms, and to some extent, if we can root these new organizational drivers into the acceptance and the truthfulness that you are pointing out, this becomes the basis for us as organizational developers, designers, entrepreneurs, to build new types of institutions. Otherwise, if we kind of give this fear for granted that John is pointing out, we seem to be coming back into our industrial thesis, of looking after our stuff and protecting our, economic, financial solidity, for example, and so on. So I will leave it to you to close, maybe with a closing remark as we approach the end of the conversation.
I'm happy to. I suppose I sit here with a bit of worry, actually. I don't know. I hear you totally, John. And I suppose my worry right now is that if, for example, we put social environmental costs on businesses, which should be happening, 70% of them would be wiped out. Extinction level event in terms of our current economy. And if we don't do that, we're wiped out anyway. So there's a kind of I suppose I don't know. I think, yes, I can say that. I'm not saying it to induce fear. I'm saying it to show, I think there's massive opportunity in the world. I think we will make this transition. However, we kind of do need to recognize that there is going to be massive differential impacts if we go to 3.5 degrees. Global North might even be okay. A little bit more hurricanes. Global South is in big trouble, with billions of people in big trouble. So there is also accountability in this sort of deep transition. And I suppose I sit here, how do we have conversations which aren't about inducing fear and inappropriate power? And it's about the kind of power that it introduces, asymmetry and vulnerability it introduces, while still having truths on the table, which actually do open up opportunities, but those opportunities are quite significant. I suppose I'm sitting in this tension of that world, where we know currently most businesses aren't even taking account of the liabilities. Most businesses are net zombie instruments. The externalities they generate are far larger than the net profits they produce. And I don't know, how do we have a robustness of debate which isn't necessarily about fear, but does engage that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that I'm often misinterpreted when I talk about opportunity-based narratives as being the eternal optimist of everything's going to be fine, we're all going to accomplish great things. No. An opportunity-based narrative is a narrative precisely because it's a call to action to say this opportunity is not going to happen until and unless we act, because there are so many challenges, roadblocks, obstacles along the way. There are a lot of things that are going to have to change for us to achieve this opportunity. So it creates, I hope, a balance between, on the one hand, the focus is on the opportunity. What is the world going to look like when we all come together and achieve this? But then recognizing and focusing people and building the courage to go in and challenge the existing institutions and the roadblocks and obstacles that we have to get there. So I think that and I think the more we focus on opportunity, the more willing we will be to come together. You know, that if there's something that's really big and inspiring that none of us could accomplish on our own, okay, let's come together. Let's figure this out. And there are huge obstacles and challenges. Let's come together to overcome those. And it brings people together. And I think, again, will be a catalyst for the kind of learning platforms that I think is such a focus for this gathering here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both. We are at the end of this section, but I want to stress one point that emerged from this conversation. I think that Indy, you brought up this idea of truthfulness and integrity. John, you brought up this idea of facing fear and overcoming it with opportunity-based narratives. I think this is a really pragmatic point. It's really about understanding that our current institutional agreements are failing us, and we need to take this responsibility. I think responsibility is a key point to put together integrity and opportunities and beyond fear. It's really about taking our responsibility to recast ourselves in this new, much more aware context where we have the responsibility to prioritize our choices, to rebuild the new institutions, because this is not going to happen, you know, magically. We have this responsibility. It's up to us. And to some extent, it's up to us, not just as single people, but also in the agreements and in the interactions between organizations, beyond organizational boundaries, that we want to pursue, we want to be protagonist of. And this really sounds like a journey beyond the fear of failing institutions into an opportunity for rebuilding a different future. Indy, just as a closing point.
Saying, I think we have to believe in the infinite potential of what it means to be human and other things in the world around us. Mathematics can't, and our financial system can't deal with infinite potential of tomorrow. Actually can't. Discount rates and everything else, that's why we have discount rates, to discount all those infinite potentials. And that fundamentally builds a very bad way of looking at the future. And I think, John, in a way, what you're inviting us to do is think about this infinite potential as well, in many of those things that are on the table, which our accounting system can't deal with. It's really interesting, just putting that straight together. Our accounting system cannot deal with the infinite potential.
I can't resist one final observation, which is the distinction between, everybody talks about the world population as 7 billion mouths to feed. I talk about it as 7 billion minds to unleash. And to your point, we have infinite potential. Imagine what we could accomplish if we unleashed all that potential and that's hidden in all of us. So.
Thanks.